those mailing lists, so I get to see these things. I don't read all of them, but I certainly read what they're about and that sort of thing, and he's got some very interesting ideas that you've heard, I trust, I'm sure. He's also, his writings have been in just about every American major newspaper: New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today. He's a prolific writer and thankfully a frequent guest lecturer. He's here and appears regularly on TV and all that. Before joining Cato in '93, Michael served as Director of Research for the Georgia Public Policy Foundation and as a Legislative Director for American Legislative Exchange Council. So I'd like to welcome Michael for our first address of the morning.
Well, thank you very much. I do have one quick housekeeping thing. I understand there are 4 emergency exits in this room, but in the event of an actual emergency, you should remain in your seat and await a federal bailout. I have to tell you, I very much thank you for the opportunity to get out. I got in shortly after midnight, so I haven't really had a chance to see much of your state yet. But I hope to go out and take a look at it. Everyone who's come up to me on the street so far has said, you know, it's beautiful. You've got to see it. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to get out here. I have to tell you, though, a little caveat on that. See, I not only work, but I live in Washington, D.C., so I'm always thrilled to get out someplace else. And I have to tell you, I'm delighted. You know, it's so much warmer out here than it is right now for a conservative in Washington, which is a little bit about what I wanted to talk to you about today. If you're a conservative, or I'm not, but for those of you who are Republicans, it certainly was not a good election this year. It's not been a good election for a couple of years. In fact, if you think back just 2 years ago, Republicans held the presidency and both houses of Congress. In just 2 years, they lost not just the presidency, but more than 50 seats in the House, a dozen seats in the Senate, with some still undecided. That's the largest back-to-back losses by any political party since the 1930s. I think clearly what you've seen is an overwhelming rejection of George Bush and of the Republican leadership in Washington and what the Republican Party appears to stand for right now in Washington. I don't think there's any way to sugarcoat that or any way to make it look like anything else other than a massive repudiation of what the Republican Party has come to stand for in Washington today. But is it more than that? Is it also a rejection of basic conservative values, of the idea, the whole concept of limited government, lower taxes, less regulation, more individual liberty, more individual control over our own lives? If you listen to the pundits, if you know, after breakfast and you can still keep your breakfast down, you can read Paul Krugman, and who I understand once upon a time was an economist. But at any rate, if you can deal with all the pundits, they'll all tell you the age of Reagan is over, that we live in a new left liberal era, and the American public has rejected all the conservative values out there. The public no longer believes in limited government. But the facts, if not the pundits, the facts seem to say otherwise. You know, if you look at the exit polls, just to give you one example, on election night, even while the public was electing Barack Obama and Democrats to the Senate and the House, the public, by a 49 to 46% margin in the exit polls, said that they believed government was doing too much as opposed to doing too little to help people. And when you consider the fact that exit polls traditionally oversample Democrats and actually skew to the left, the actual margin was probably even larger. I'm sure it was over 50% of the public believing that we have a government that does too much. And this is actually in line with other recent polls, even while all this was going on. In September, there was a Gallup poll And by 53 to 40, low 40s margin, the public said that they thought the government was doing too many things that were better left to businesses and individuals. A Rasmussen poll came to almost exactly the same conclusion. And in fact, in October, a Rasmussen poll found that 56% of likely voters said that they believed, they agreed with Ronald Reagan's statement that government isn't the solution, government is the problem. How then did we end up with a public that basically believes in the idea of limited government, choosing a candidate who quite honestly and frankly said that he wanted to increase the size of government? And the same, of course, at the congressional and senatorial level. Well, and largely, I think it was because the public was never offered a small government choice. You know, with George W. Bush as president, we had a president whom, if you took the R off of the end of his name and put a D in there, and if he had never invaded Iraq, would have made pretty much any liberal Democrat proud. This is a president, after all, who increased federal domestic discretionary spending faster than any president since Lyndon Johnson launched the Great Society. This is a president who gave us the first new federal entitlement program in 40 years, established a Medicare prescription drug benefit that will add $11 trillion, that's $1 trillion with a T, in unfunded liabilities to the future federal debt that we're passing on to our kids and our grandkids. We've heard all about how it was George Bush's deregulation that led to the financial crisis. But the reality is there was not a single major deregulatory move during the Bush administration. And in fact, on the financial scene, you actually had Sarbanes-Oxley, a re-regulation of the financial industry. And in fact, the Bush administration added 7,000 pages of regulation to the Federal Register during their time in office. They created the first new cabinet department in a couple of decades. They federalized the air transport, the air safety screeners at the airport, made them federal employees. They created new tariffs on steel and lumber. This was an administration that acted much the way we could almost expect an Obama administration to act, other than the war. It became the war defining, essentially, conservatism. And you had a candidate in John McCain, who, for all of his criticism of federal spending, railing against earmarks, actually proposed federal spending that was only slightly less than the proposals that Barack Obama made. This was a candidate on our side who actually said that he wanted an additional $300 billion bailout of people's mortgages. The public was never given an alternative of a candidate who actually stood up for the ideas of limited government and individual liberty. Essentially, they had a choice of the status quo, which was a vaguely incompetent big government conservatism, or change, which was a promise of a perhaps more competent big government liberalism. Faced with that choice, it's not surprising that the public chose change. But none of this means that conservatism or the belief in limited government or the belief in individual liberty is dead or has been rejected. There still is a viable constituency out there for the ideas that we believe in. The question's going to be is what's going to happen to the conservative movement over the next couple of years. Because right now it is gathering in its biannual circular firing squad. And to some degree, this is necessary. There has to be a sorting out of what conservatism actually is. And at the moment, I would suggest you have three different factions within the conservative movement. The first faction is a group that believes that essentially what conservatives need to do is that they need to become, well, liberal. And this is the group that believes that, as Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty has said, the era of small government is over. And you can find these folks, David Brooks in the New York Times,